What's up, my friends? I'm back today talking about Cradle once more. Today, we're talking about Book 6, Underlord. Naturally, this is going to have some spoilers in it for Book 6 and all the books before this. We're 6 books into a series. It's going to have some pretty big spoilers for these things. So, if you haven't read it yet, and you haven't read any of the books, go do that. I highly recommend them. And if you haven't read Book 6 yet, go do that. This is a really good book. And with that out of the way, let's start talking about this book. Taking off right where we were in Ghostwater, Lindon is now a true gold. Lindon gets together with all of his friends again. They're reunited. Immediately, they dive into a fight with some Skysworn True Golds. And this fight is just a spectacle, an amazing kickoff to this book. And what's even better is we're seeing this from the perspective of the Skysworn for a lot of the fight. We get to see just how intimidating Lindon is to the enemies that he's been punching in the face. He's got the black flame aura and those eyes of a demon for his gold sign. Lindon has been getting stronger and has been winning more fights without just cunning. He's been winning them with strength, with skill. And I think that that's really emphasized when you get to see this fight through the eyes of the Skysworn. Will Wight's decision to show this fight not as we're expecting through Lindon or one of his teammates is a really good one. And it's also showcasing his skills as a writer to be able to continue writing a super epic character even when you're not just in their head. When you're in the mind of a character doing cool things, it's gonna feel cool. What, like 6 books ago, I was cheering for Lindon punching literal 7-year-olds in the face because internally it felt earned at the time. But now we've seen him working hard. We've seen all of these things that he's been doing for the last 6 books. And now others are starting to see those things as well. It's not just he's cheating out a win or the fights are very one-sided, it seems, but in actuality, Lindon's on par with them because he's just so weak like we were seeing in book 1. No, he looks like the baddie in a lot of these fights. He's this big, scary, intimidating thing walking over the horizon at you. And that's a really cool thing to be able to convey through changing the POV to a different person in the fight that is going against him. The rest of the setup for this book is building up the hype around this great anime tournament arc that we're about to dive into in the coming books. It's been mentioned offhandedly before, but now it's the forefront plot point. It's what they need to be preparing for. The lesser clans in the Akura sphere of influence now need to set up some champions for this fight. And from the Akura clan themselves, they're offered this crazy high Madra training valley for them to progress some of their strongest fighters to Underlord so that they can actually be ready for this fight. The requirements for the fight being you gotta be under 35 and you have to be Underlord. And that's the whole path of this book. Going to that valley, training, and becoming an Underlord. That's Lindon's arc this book, that's Yaren's arc this book, that's Mercy's arc this book. That's the name of the game. It's called Underlord. Of course it's gonna be everyone's path. They gotta get big and buff for what I imagine is going to be probably one of the coolest tournament arcs in tournament arc history. I mean, there's a lot of contenders for that spot. You got the Fairy Tail arc, you got the Jujutsu Kaisen arc, you got the Mario 1000-Year Door Glitz Pit, but something tells me that the Uncrowned King Tournament is going to take the cake just based on how hype and incredibly well done all of the build-up to it has been. In continuing with things that this book did really well, it introduces a lot of mix-ups to the expected rhythm of the story so far. We saw it kind of happen in Ghostwater, but I think it was a bit of a weaker attempt at doing this, because now not only do we have these new forms of progression Ghostwater kind of toyed with, but it was still the same end goal for what you were doing. You were still just trying to get stronger, build up your Madra channels, punch harder. But in Ghostwater, it was just like a little bit of a different process. You were just kind of drinking a lot of gamer fuel and then muscles were growing. But a bigger thing as a reader is, after the fact, Ghostwater felt like it had goals. It had to do certain things and it accomplished doing those things. We had to see Lindon become more of a leader and more confident in himself, so we had to split him away from the group. He had to go through these shortcuts to be able to hit True Gold so that we could have Underlord happen immediately after it. We had to set up Dross to be able to continue down the more, I guess, D plot line of the Abadan. But as you were reading Ghostwater, none of these goals from a reader's perspective were clear. You have to have read it and then look back at it to really appreciate what was going on in that book. That's a big reason why I kind of rate it so low in my rankings of these books. Underlord, however, similar to the older books, we have a strong goal with a limited amount of time to get there. Lindon and his team have to reach Underlord by the due date for the tournament. This creates that kind of time crunch stake that really ramps up. Will they have enough time to be able to jump this valley to be able to become Underlords. And I suppose that Ghostwater kind of implemented this with this looming threat of Ghostwater itself falling apart, kind of like a ticking time bomb situation, but it was still not as concrete. It felt like it could happen at any moment, so it wasn't going to happen until the important things did. It's still writing. He's going to make it there by the end of the book. It's a way more hard, fast deadline than just whenever Ghostwater gets weak enough to crumble. And there's a distinction there between the two things, where one is like soft magic, where it's going to happen and it is a looming threat, but we're not totally sure that we can really gauge what's going on. Whereas in this book, when Lindon has to wait a few weeks to be able to do something, we know that that's chipping away time that he has to train. We know that the date isn't going to get pushed back. It's not like, oh, I'm able to strengthen up the defenses of Ghostwater and keep it contained for just a little longer to eke out. No, when that date passes, he's not in the tournament. I also really like the distinction that is drawn between the lower climbing of the ranks and progressing into becoming an Underlord. It's yet again another good mix-up for this book. There's a clear step up in advancement here as to why it's so hard to become an Underlord, why so many people stay at True Gold and never advance. And these requirements not only make sense in the world, but they do a lot from a narrative craft perspective of building out these characters in more interesting and unique ways. And it's really adding to the feeling of it's more than just getting stronger, but it's gaining understanding of the world around you, of yourself, of Madra and sacred arts as a whole. And the decision to do this and to do it well as it was done in Underlord speaks once again to Will Wight's craft in the way he's able to mix up how progression works, keep it interesting, and still give us a lot of heavy lifting for making these characters deeper and more interesting as we go. Progression in Cradle never feels boring. It never feels repetitive or tiring. There's always a new way to progress, whether that was the 1,000 ways that Lindon cheated his way up the ladder to True Gold, or now where it's something completely different and he now gets a whole book to struggle with this. And I think that that variety of progression is super critical to this book to keep the reader from fatiguing from just reading the same thing over and over again. Goku just had to do bigger push-ups somewhere, or they had to train longer in the heavy gravity field. And what's kind of weaker about those choices than choosing a different way to progress when it gets harder is that those characters then just need to take a back seat while they're doing that. It's not an interesting thing to read about Goku doing more push-ups or him just kind of, I don't know, sitting and meditating in a gravity field, even though I guess Lindon does kind of sit and meditate in this book, but that's beside the point. Moving on. The goal of, oh, you need to be stronger in other progression stories is to remove the character from the story for a little bit so they can train. It's an opportunity to make other characters shine. But when the payoff is that they weren't there and they needed to be, so then they get there and then they save the day, does that really make the other characters shine? Like Ichigo showing up at the end of the Karakura Town fights. In Cradle, all of this training that they do is front and center. It's the thing that we care about the most. At times, it's the main barrier that the characters have to bust through to be able to keep going with the story. It's a good tool that requires introspection and really takes a unique approach to progressing, because obviously when you hit a point, punching harder is only going to get you so far. Yaren's arc in this book was probably my favorite of the three. Not only do we get some really cool narrative choices of what's going on and how she's going to move forward with her own progression, but we just get some really cool low-key scenes in the book that are kind of focused on her. Like when she ends up losing to the Seishen gardener, Mera, I think, or maybe Mayra, and she goes to the med center. Aithen comes in and starts talking about all the magical healing properties of all these foods that he's bringing, and rice, because rice is just good for you. And this small scene just continues to showcase this very fine line that Cradle is running between life or death situations and just lighthearted fun. They're all kids still. They're all pretty young. These moments just kind of give you a second to breathe as a reader and laugh with these characters. And that's not something that happens super often when they're all just kind of fighty, fighty, punch, punch all the time. This new struggle that fight creates for Yaren creates a lot of great setup for practically handing her the path forward, but still creating a dilemma for her. She is provided these three options for how to progress her blood path. This failure in her fight provides the necessary first steps to the most powerful option, something that she was very wary of doing before this, but now is almost forced into, the thing that Aithen wanted her to choose. It dodges around the really hard moral conundrum that Yaren has of feeding life essence to the blood shadow in a more interesting way than just cutting that option off or making her go into that all at once. A failure in a fight leading to a new path of of progression that you didn't see before that fight is something that's pretty interesting. And finding success through failures is a pretty consistent theme, and it just works really well here. The introduction of the Seishen family was an amazing refresher from book 5. In my talk about Ghostwater, I kind of voiced this issue. The loss of the Jai clan, we don't have a lot of characters that we can kind of bounce off of and understand that they aren't 100% totally evil. They do have their own drives and goals, and those are going to be clashing up against Lindon and the Aurelius family. And I think that the Seishen family fills that hole really well. Mara and her drives of love and loyalty feel really compelling as to why she just goes bonkers and tries to kill them with all of her strength. And then you've got this classic kind of familial dueling that's occurring between Daji and Kiro, and their dynamics of one is already an Underlord, one is a True Gold trying to get there, and both of them living in the shadow of their father, King Takata. I'm also really glad that we're edging closer and closer to merging the Abadan and the Cradle storylines. This, what was once a super far away Z plot of these godly sci-fi figures, is eking ever closer, especially with the new capabilities of Dross in this book. Through Dross, it really feels like we've kind of unlocked a new branch of exploration of the systems of this world. The simulations of soulsmithing really make this more mystical magic system feel scientific. And it continues with this idea that he's essentially becoming a presence. He's able to do these chrono timeline simulations that they're able to train with. He's able to kind of almost freeze time for Lindon so that he can better react and fight in tense situations. He's really starting to mirror 100% what I was initially thinking he was going to be, which is a weaker presence right now. And I imagine that because he has also grown Madra channels from being in that well for so long, we're going to see him progress as well. And we're going to get him to the point where he is able to do a lot of the crazy things that a presence can do. But what's more important about Dross is he's really tying together that sci-fi outer world with the mystic arts of Cradle. It's something that other progression stories try to do, but they never do it well enough. They always end up bringing these more wild and crazy elements in near the end of the story, and it can leave readers feeling kind of bait and switched. It puts them in a situation where I really enjoy reading the first portion of this book. I really like the tone and the genre that's setting up, and then they're like, oh, forget about all of that. We're going sci-fi. Get out your blasters, everyone. Pew, pew, pew. This one is able to slowly eke in points. It's been weaving it throughout the story, and it's setting up those promises that it's not just this one thing. And so readers at book 6 are already bought into the idea that these things are going to collapse into each other. And so we're able to see these sensical steps that are being taken to get to that point. It kind of shows me, while not in a whole, it shows me a scope that I'm now prepared for instead of being surprised with later on. And all of these great things that happen in this book bring us to the final, and what I can only say is the best fight of Cradle so far. The showdown in the vault is hands down the dopest thing that I've read in Cradle. Lindon has 2 cannons, and that just is what starts the fight. He's clashing with Kiro, Mara's clashing with Yaren off in another room, and you have Mercy fighting Daji, pulling him away from everyone else. It's creating these 3 individual scenes that are all coming together and the culmination of all 3 character building arcs, and it feels so good to be bouncing between them. The scenes with Mercy having to cash in her instant revive from her mom was an immense roller coaster of emotions. But man, she's finally powered up, and we get to see her do some serious damage. And we also get to see Akura Malice, like a full monarch in all of their glory here. It feels so exciting to be like, oh, monarchs are finally becoming relevant. We also get this really dope kind of domino effect of all of them advancing to Underlord, one after the other. This whole spike of the final battle really feels like a Brandon Sanderson kind of avalanche that happens at the end of his books. Everyone is coming to internal realizations as they need to grow, and they need to all do them in dire circumstances, and it feels earned. It feels deserved. I'm not saying that this is unique to this book. Obviously, in other fighting stories, you have these character moments align with pivotal fight scenes. Those other moments feel shallow almost. The meme of, oh, I now believe in my friends so I can punch harder, doesn't really tie into what those worlds have created and set up to that point. But the idea of being able to better understand yourself in the world around you has been what the whole point of this book is. And for them to have that overwhelming character realization and then be able to win the fight off of that, tying those 2 things together of strength and character growth is obviously, from a narrative craft perspective, really critical in conveying to a reader something. But it's also just so much more satisfying as a reader to be able to feel like I am now more connected to these characters and they're doing really cool things. And then right after that, we get this really good yes, but kind of writing structure that occurs. Yes, they all won their fights, but Mercy and Lindon now have to get kidnapped by the Akura family to participate in the tournament for them. He has to leave Yeren once again, whose dynamic with Lindon has really, really grown, and it's grown in a very natural way, something that I really enjoyed. I've been worried that they were going to try and shoehorn in some kind of romance with them. As what I imagine is a romance has been eking into the story, I'm really enjoying just how slow going it is. These two are friends who are racing each other to the top, constantly competing, constantly trying to outdo one another, but they care for each other so much. They want the other one to be strong. They want the other to stay caught up with them. And that friendly competition, that wholesomeness to it, really feeds into their characters, really feeds into their connection to each other. It's really fun to read. It's really good as a reader to have two characters that are competing and that the characters are able to enjoy this competition. And that's a nice dichotomy in this really gruesome world of complete and utter destruction all over the place that is Cradle. And of course, we get that epilogue. Oh man, that epilogue. The great return to the Sacred Valley has been teased. Obviously, I expect we're going to get a right proper reunion of Lindon and all those haters, all those naysayers in the Sacred Valley. He's gonna show up as like an Omega Overlord, Sage Monarch, King God, and they're just, what, I think his sister and parents are still iron? Iron? Come on. That gives me like this sense of pride for Lindon that he's able to show off when he gets home. That's really cool. He's just gonna be able to laugh at all these low power losers. But also this scene is setting up a solid lead on why the Sword Sage was able to be so easily killed by a bunch of Jades. There's kind of this hint of maybe a dampening field that brings all Omega overpowered people down to the level of Jade. Something fishy's going on there with the Dread Beasts and the tunnels and that big door with the symbols on it. Right when I think that we're breaching the scope of what this story can give us. All in all, book 6 is amazing. It's knocked into the first spot of my tier list. I'm extremely excited for the coming books because this was just set up for the tournament. So if I love what was just set up, I can only imagine what's about to come. I'll give it 19 out of 20 of Sukuna's little fingies. The pacing is as strong as ever, despite being exclusively focused on mostly preparation for the next book. The character moments feel so good and natural, and just more promises for what's to come through character arcs. Have you read book 6? Did you like it as much as I did? If you're excited for the next book, let me know in the comments. And while you're down there, why don't you hit that little like button if you liked anything that I had to say? And if you haven't yet, why don't you hit that subscribe button? Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll catch you in the next one. And until then, stay lit.